Picture this. It is 186 BC. You are a Roman father. Your household is respected, wealthy, well-connected, secure within the social order of the city. You have fulfilled every expectation placed upon you. You have arranged an excellent marriage for your daughter. The alliance strengthens your position. The dowry is generous. The future appears stable and approved by every standard that matters. Your daughter is 16. She is educated, carefully raised, trained in obedience, modesty, and duty, everything Roman society demands of bride. The wedding unfolds flawlessly. Prayers are spoken. Omens are favorable. The feast is extravagant. Guests praise your generosity. Your daughter smiles at the proper moments. She performs happiness exactly as she has been taught. And then, when the public celebration ends, something else begins. Your daughter is led away for the final rite. The one no one explains. The one never discussed openly. The one every Roman family knows exists, yet pretends not to see. As she is taken from the hall, she looks back once. Her eyes meet yours. There's a question there, unspoken but unmistakable. You do not answer it. Not because you do not love her. Not because you are cruel. But because you know what is coming, and you know you cannot stop it. This was a ritual Rome buried so deeply that even ancient historians avoided naming it directly. What survives comes only in fragments. Legal language without explanation, censored plays, sealed chambers beneath temples, names carved into stone stripped of context. What follows is not a myth invented by Rome's enemies. It is drawn from surviving legal concepts, archaeological evidence, and ancient writers who hinted at something they could not openly describe. Taken together, these sources reveal something profoundly unsettling about how religion, law, and marriage intersected in ancient Rome. Here is what scholars can say with confidence. Between roughly 300 BCE and 200 CE, Roman marriage was not merely a private agreement between families. It was also a religious transaction. Legal sources make clear that a marriage was not considered fully valid until specific sacred requirements were fulfilled, requirements overseen not by husbands, but by religious authorities. Later medieval writers would use the term ius primi noctis to describe similar ideas. That phrase does not appear in Roman legal texts, but Roman sources point to a ritual framed as an offering to the gods, sometimes reconstructed under the name deditio deorum, a symbolic giving over that occurred before marriage could be completed. The terminology matters. Nothing about this was described as violence. It was described as obligation, as duty. If you believe suppressed histories, especially those involving the powerless, deserve to be remembered, consider supporting this work. Bringing these practices into light challenges narratives that were meant to remain comfortable. Now, let's examine what Roman fathers never explained to their daughters. Act 1. The legal foundation. Under Roman law, marriage transferred a woman from the authority of her father to that of her husband. This transfer was called manus, literally the hand. A woman passed from one hand to another. But legal and religious sources suggest this transfer was not automatic. Before a woman could fully become a wife, she had to be purified. That word appears again and again, purificatio. Purification was not symbolic. It was a ritual act overseen by religious authorities, described in legal language as guardians of divine will, priests. Among the most prominent were those associated with Bona Dea, the good goddess, whose cult centered on fertility, reproduction, and the protection of Roman households. Her rites were secret, restricted, and legally shielded from scrutiny. Roman religion operated on exchange. You offered something to the gods, and the gods granted favor in return. Crops, fertility, protection, stability. Marriage was no exception. But here, the offering was not wine, grain, or sacrificial animals. It was the bride herself. Imagine what that meant in practice. She is 16, perhaps 17, raised to believe that marriage is her highest duty. She knows obedience. She knows silence. She knows endurance. What she does not know, because no one tells her, is that before she belongs to her husband, He must first belong to the gods, and the gods demand proof. Act 2. The descent across Rome. Archaeologists have uncovered underground chambers beneath major Roman temples. These spaces are neither burial crypts nor storage rooms, yet they share unsettling similarities. Stone platforms shaped like beds, channels cut into floors for drainage, and heavy doors designed to lock from the outside. In 2003, excavations beneath a temple long associated with Bona Dea on the Aventine Hill revealed one such chamber in unusually preserved condition. The most disturbing feature was not the architecture. It was the writing. Carved into the walls were hundreds of names, all female, many accompanied by dates. When compared with surviving records, those dates align with known Roman wedding celebrations. British archaeologist Catherine Johns, who spent 3 years documenting the site, cautiously concluded that these inscriptions recorded women who had undergone a ritual connected to marriage eligibility. She noted that the nature of the ritual was not explicitly stated, a phrase that appears often in academic writing, signaling restraint rather than ignorance. What follows is a reconstruction drawn from literary hints, later commentary, and the physical evidence itself. After the public wedding, the bride was not taken home by her husband. He was excluded. Instead, she was escorted by female attendants, often older women who had undergone the same rite, to the temple. She was led downward, away from light and witnesses. Stone steps, cold air, a chamber beneath the city. The sources differ on what happened next. Some suggest one priest. Others imply several. The inconsistency itself is telling. What survives are echoes. The playwright Plautus, writing in the early 2nd century BC, alluded to such rites in a comedy later heavily censored. In one surviving fragment, a character remarks, "The gods take their portion before any man." Another asks what the bride receives in return. The answer, purification if she survives it. That line does not appear in later copies. The philosopher Lucretius, writing in the 1st century BC, refers to the rites of Bona Dea in unusually direct language. His words survive only because a single manuscript escaped medieval erasure. He writes, "They call these rites sacred, but they are terror, what the priest claims to offer the gods. He takes for himself, and the law shelters the theft by naming it divine." Now place yourself back in the position of the father. You know this exists. You know your daughter will undergo it. You do nothing because refusing would mean defying religion, law, and tradition. And in Rome, tradition carried the force of inevitability. The system was designed so that no one could resist without destroying themselves. And that was only the beginning. The power of the system did not come from force alone. It came from silence. Act 3. The Silence Protocol. What made this practice so difficult to expose, both in antiquity and now, was not a lack of victims. It was the law. Roman women who underwent sacred rites were not merely discouraged from speaking about them. They were legally forbidden. Certain religious ceremonies were classified as mysteria, sacred acts protected by secrecy statutes. To reveal them was not framed as testimony. It was framed as impiety. The Lex Ficonia, passed in 169 BC, included provisions governing religious disclosure. Women who revealed the contents of sacred rites could be charged with impiety and punished with exile, seizure of property, or death. This is why the historical record feels incomplete. This is why historians encounter gaps, euphemisms, and evasive language. The victims were legally silenced. The perpetrators called it sacred. And the men who recorded history were often beneficiaries of the system. But silence is not the same as forgetting. Sometimes, when speech is forbidden, people find other ways to leave evidence. Speaking without words. In the 1920s, archaeologists excavating a villa on the outskirts of Pompeii uncovered a sealed chamber. It was not closed by volcanic ash. The doorway had been deliberately bricked up before the eruption. Inside was a fresco. At first glance, it depicted a conventional Roman wedding scene. The bride at the center, the groom beside her, guests gathered, familiar iconography. But in the background, partially obscured, was another scene, a woman being led downward by robed figures, her body angled away from the celebration, her head turned back, one arm reaching to a man who was not following. The archaeologist who documented the fresco made a striking observation. The hidden figure's face, barely visible, was painted with greater precision and emotional detail than the bride at the center. Someone wanted that face to be seen. They could not describe the ritual openly. That would have been illegal, but they could paint it, they could hide it, and they could hope someone someday would understand. That is not passive acceptance. That is documentation. Act 4, the aftermath. After the ritual concluded, the bride was returned to the wedding celebration. Hours had passed, sometimes an entire day. Roman wedding customs included detail that puzzled historians for generations. The bride appeared before her husband wearing a veil called a flammeum, a thick, brightly colored cloth. What made this unusual was not the veil itself, but the rules surrounding it. The veil was never removed, not during the feast, not during the procession, not even during consummation. For centuries, scholars interpreted this as modesty, an expression of Roman virtue and decorum. But a closer look at Roman medical literature suggests another explanation. Feminist historian Amy Richland, examining ancient gynecological texts, highlighted a passage written by the physician Sorinus in the 2nd century CE. In a treatise on women's health, Sorinus notes that newly married brides often exhibited signs of recent physical trauma. He advises physicians and husbands alike, the veil serves a double purpose. It preserves modesty and prevents the husband from observing signs of the purification rite, which might provoke improper questions. Read that again. The veil did not symbolize virtue. It concealed evidence. The bride could not speak about what had happened. That was illegal. The husband was discouraged from noticing. That was custom. And any distress was explained away as nervousness, fear, or inexperience. The system did not require universal belief. It required compliance. For generations, it worked. Act 5, the breaking point. In 186 BC, the system nearly collapsed. That year, a Roman woman named Hispalophicinia went before the consuls and described abuses within the Bacchanalia, secret religious rites that had been operating across Italy. Her testimony, recorded by the historian Livy, described underground chambers, sexual violence carried out under religious authority, and victims bound by silence laws. The Senate reacted with shock. Investigations were launched, priests were arrested, rites were banned, leaders executed, thousands punished. Rome wanted to make an example of the Bacchanalia, but something unexpected happened during that investigation. Several women attempted to testify about marriage purification rituals, not rites of foreign cults, but ones connected to Roman tradition itself. The Senate refused to hear them. According to Livy, the consul Spurius Postumius dismissed the request with a statement that revealed everything. The Bacchanalia are foreign corruptions. The rites of bona die are Roman tradition. We do not investigate tradition. Those words became the backbone of every system that survives abuse. Call it ancient, call it sacred, call it tradition, and suddenly it becomes untouchable. The women who attempted to testify were warned to remain silent or face charges of impiety. Most complied. One did not. Her name does not survive. She stood in the forum and publicly described what had happened to her beneath the temple. Within hours, she was arrested, charged with impiety and public obscenity. She was exiled to Sicily, forbidden from returning to Rome, forbidden from speaking to Roman citizens. She disappears from the historical record, but not everything disappears. In 1964, archaeologists discovered a piece of graffiti carved near the Roman Forum. The lettering style and surrounding context date to approximately 180 BC, just a few years after Bacchanalia scandal. It reads, "Tradition is what monsters call their crimes when no one stops them." Someone carved that message into stone at the center of Roman political power. Someone risked everything to leave it behind. And that brings us to what Rome could never fully erase. The ritual did not vanish. It evolved. By the late 1st century BC, Elite families began to find ways around it. Instead of submitting their daughters to full purification rites, they paid for symbolic ceremonies, rituals without chambers, without descent, without physical contact. The priests accepted these substitutions. Of course, they did, because this had never truly been about religion. It was about power. Once wealth could buy exemption, the nature of the system became impossible to ignore. Among elite families, the practice gradually faded. Among the poor, it did not. They could not afford alternatives. The Satyricon, written around 100 C, notes this disparity with bitter clarity. The poor still offer their daughters to the old gods. The rich offered gold instead. The system did not end because it was recognized as wrong. It weakened because participation became optional for those with power. And that distinction, who could opt out and who could not, reveals everything about what the system was designed to protect. In the end, the ritual did not collapse because Rome experienced a moral awakening. It ended where it ended only because powerful men decided they no longer wanted it touching their own families. As long as the consequences fell on other people's daughters, the practice was defended as ancient, sacred, and necessary. The moment it threatened elite households, it became negotiable. That single fact tells you everything about who the system was designed to protect, and what historians chose to look away from. For centuries, classical scholars minimized or dismissed accounts like these. They described the evidence as fragmentary. They warned that ancient sources were unreliable. They suggested exaggeration, misinterpretation, or later invention. They did everything except confront the pattern itself. Why? Because acknowledging this practice forces an uncomfortable conclusion. Rome, so often praised as a foundation of Western law and civilization, embedded coercion and sexual exploitation into rituals presented as sacred and lawful. It means admitting that Roman marriage was not merely a private contract between families. It was a transaction that, in certain contexts, placed women's bodies under religious authority before transferring them to husbands. That realization destabilizes the traditional story of Roman virtue, order, and progress. So scholars hesitated. They focused on what could be safely admired. They emphasized architecture, engineering, jurisprudence, and they avoided asking what those systems cost the people with the least power. But in the last few decades, that avoidance has become harder to maintain. Evidence that could no longer be ignored has emerged. Archaeology does not argue. Underground chambers exist beneath temples long associated with marriage and fertility rites. Inscriptions exist, names carved by women who left no other testimony. Legal language exists, vague, euphemistic, but persistent. Literary references exist, censored, fragmented, but consistent in tone. Individually, each piece might be dismissed. Taken together, they form a pattern. In 2018, a research team affiliated with the American Academy in Rome published a comprehensive review of available evidence relating to premarital purification rituals in Roman religious practice. Their conclusion was measured, careful, and difficult to ignore. They wrote that the evidence strongly suggests certain purification rites associated with marriage involve coercive sexual acts carried out under religious authority, reinforced by legal and social structures that prevented resistance or accountability. That is academic language translated plainly. This happened, it was not accidental, and the system protected itself. Yet, this is not only a story about abuse. It is also a story of resistance, quiet, dangerous, and easily erased, but real. There was a woman who stood in the forum and spoke, knowing exactly what would happen to her. She was not saved, but she refused to pretend. There was the artist who painted the hidden fresco in Pompeii, carefully rendering a face meant to be overlooked, trusting that someone in the future might see it. There was the person who carved a sentence into stone near the Roman Forum, naming tradition for what it was. There were families who found ways to avoid the ritual, not because they openly challenged the system, but because they prioritized their daughter's safety over unquestioned obedience. There were historians and copyists who preserved dangerous fragments, even when the safer option was silence. None of these people stopped the machine on their own, but they documented it. They left traces. and those traces survived Rome's power. This history reveals something important, something Rome tried very hard to hide. Systems of abuse rarely collapse because everyone suddenly agrees they are wrong. They collapse because enough people refuse to participate, because enough people withdraw consent, leave records, and decide that tradition does not excuse cruelty. The wealthy families who paid for symbolic rituals did not suddenly develop moral clarity. They acted out of self-interest. But that was enough. One family refusing, then 10, then 100. Eventually, priests could no longer insist that participation was universal. The ritual lost its inevitability. And once inevitability disappears, so does authority. Stand in Rome today, and you can see the remains of these temples. On the surface, there is nothing dramatic. Broken columns, scattered stone. Tourists pass by without stopping. But beneath the ruins, the chambers remain. On the walls, the names are still there. Julia, Cornelia, Flavia, Fulvia. Women whose fathers brought them here. Women who underwent rituals they were forbidden to describe. Women who could not testify, could not accuse, could not refuse. So they did the only thing they could. They carved their names, not as rebellion, not as protest, but as proof of existence. I was here. This happened to me. They left those words without letters, trusting that someday someone might understand what they were not allowed to say. We found them. We understand. And we refuse to let Rome's version of history be the only one that survives. If this exposed something you were never taught, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. This channel, Sinister Empires, exists to uncover practices powerful institutions tried to erase. Before you go, ask yourself this. What would you do if you were forced to obey a tradition that demanded silence over truth?